Number 20, The Big Short. Now that the dust has settled from the collapse of the housing market in 2007 and the subsequent recession, the causes and effects of this crisis have become prime fodder for filmmakers to create engaging drama. More on that later. But how would a director with a background in comedy deal with such a devastating turn of events? Best known for the Anchorman films, Adam McKay isn't the first name that comes to mind when you think of facts-based dramas. So imagine my surprise when I discovered that this is actually an enthralling and informative telling of the events that cost millions of jobs and forced millions out of their homes. In fact, McKay's comedic sensibilities are almost a necessity because the factors that led to the economic downturn are so ridiculous that they border on farce. Truly expansive in scope, this film manages multiple plot lines deftly and allows time for all of its outsized star power to shine. Steve Carell continues his run of films showcasing his dramatic talents, Christian Bale once again disappears into one of his funniest roles since American Psycho, Ryan Gosling is a welcome presence after a brief hiatus from movies, here essentially playing his version of Jordan Belfort from The Wolf of Wall Street, and Brad Pitt is content to underplay an ex-banker turned doomsday prepper. The fast-paced editing style does begin to wear on the viewer as it goes, but that's nowhere near enough to the detriment of this film as a whole to not recommend it. Gleefully self-aware and bitingly realistic, this is a true story that has to be seen to be believed. Number 19, Mr. Holmes. With the wildly popular BBC series Sherlock and CBS's American reimagining Elementary and the recent film starring Robert Downey Jr., there wasn't much demand for more Sherlock Holmes, and given the emphasis on action in most recent adaptations, surely an aging Holmes was out of the question. But director Bill Condon pulls it off in spectacular fashion. Based on a lesser-known story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the film follows the real detective that was made into legend by hyperbole and fanaticism, now in his 90s trying to recall his final case and find closure in identifying a detail he may have missed, and at last be free from a past torment. The film further endangers its success by revealing most of the iconic imagery associated with Holmes to be works of fiction, but this only works to the advantage of the story by focusing on the man himself and not the myth built around him. He's humbled and humanized by mistakes that many incarnations would have the reader or viewer believe could never be made by the eponymous sleuth. An extended look at the difficulty Holmes faces at the hands of degenerative memory loss gives the proceedings a deep pathos as we watch a great mind destroying itself and taking the hero's greatest weapon. But if I have anything negative to say about this film, it's that a subplot involving an excursion to post-war Japan feels oddly tangent to the story, though it ultimately does tie into the overall arc, and even then these scenes are still enthralling to watch, they just feel disconnected from the rest. On a technical level, this is exquisite filmmaking, and all of this adds up to a good movie, but where it transcends success and achieves vitality is the performance of Sir Ian McKellen. In every scene of confusion, he cuts to the core of human empathy, and in the lucid moments, the character is instantly recognizable, making me wish that Sir Ian had assumed the role much earlier, and this could be celebrated as the culmination of an illustrious run. I've probably made it sound quite gloomy, but this is really an overwhelmingly positive film that leaves a sense of optimism in anyone who comes across it. Do yourself the kindness of discovering this masterpiece. Number 18, The Hateful Eight. For a while, it looked like the world might never see this film. The script was leaked online, and writer-director Quentin Tarantino's secretive and eccentric tendencies led him to announce the project's cancellation. But after some consideration, Tarantino decided that he would rewrite the ending and go ahead with filming. So my anticipation quotient for this movie was at an all-time high. So much to my delight, I was able to attend an early screening of it in 70mm roadshow presentation. In a format that hasn't been used widely for nearly 50 years, the roadshow features an overture and an intermission, as well as being projected on real film prints. Maybe a little gimmicky, but a fun callback to the olden days of cinema. And my expectations for this movie were really high and they weren't quite met, but this is still excellent filmmaking. Tarantino's lavish dialogue crackles with humor despite its dark subject matter, and there's not a bad acting performance in the bunch. Perhaps the most visually stunning work in the director's oeuvre, which only makes sense given that its aspect ratio is the same that was used for the famous chariot race in Ben-Hur. Some may find it too violent and even more unsettling than Quentin Tarantino's other works, but this film made me realize something about his films that I haven't about others. Quentin Tarantino uses extreme violence and graphic depictions of death in his films because it's what he fears most. He's realized the depths of human cruelty and been scared by this realization, so to depict it so realistically is his answer to the sanitized violence of most action films that makes dying seem like no big deal. He refuses to lie to the audience and the consequences of violence and the nature of cruelty. Now, this is just my interpretation, but I think that what you take away from anything you find uncomfortable can help you reconcile its existence by understanding it. But that's up to you. I enjoyed this film, and I recommend it to the open-minded, but I understand if you'd rather not spend 3 hours on something outside your comfort zone. Number 17, Brooklyn. This is certainly a much more rosy view of the challenges faced by immigrants in the 20th century than, say, something like The Immigrant, but this film's focus is less broad than immigration as a whole, instead choosing the life of one young woman from Ireland and giving credence to her struggles. But instead of the usual roadblocks of poverty and prejudice creating the conflict, the ideas of homesickness and loneliness that can only be eased by the familiarity of the people and the place that one calls home are highlighted. This is at war with the romantic ideas of new and unknown possibilities at the expense of comfort. But what happens when the new and exciting becomes your new reality just before tragedy forces you to return to the familiar, which now seems more comfortable and sensible than before? That question drives the entire narrative of this adaptation of Colm Twelband's novel. The film encourages introspection that can be applied to any aspect of life. Do we settle or do we dare? With an intellectual splendor matched by visual splendor, courtesy of cinematographer Yves Bélanger, who foregoes the handheld techniques employed in Dallas Buyers Club and Wild, and embraces the static shot, much to the benefit of the actors who are given the freedom to move and make every frame feel alive with their performances alone. Emery Cohen and Donald Gleason give noteworthy turns as polar opposite love interests to the protagonist, played to perfection by Saoirse Ronan, who was just 13 the last time she received an Oscar nomination, but who should be given another nod and be in serious consideration for taking home the trophy for this deeply moving performance. In line with its themes, this is a story that feels familiar but dares to break new ground. Don't let this one get by you, worth whatever time you have to dedicate to seeing it. Number 16, 99 Homes. In every director's bag of tricks, there's the long take. Letting the action on screen play out at length without cutting, this technique can be used to create a sense of immediacy, highlight the performance of an actor, or even show off a well-choreographed action sequence. Last year's Best Picture winner Birdman employed this method to make it appear as if the entire film takes place in one continuous shot. It's an ambitious means to achieve the desired effect of the director, but it can pay off in dramatic tension and ease of editing later on. 99 Homes opens on one of the most effective long takes I've ever seen. It's by no means the most complicated setup or anywhere near the longest, but in just a few short minutes, this one take establishes the location, time period, and tone of the film, while also introducing the most pivotal character in the story and giving insight into that character's methods and end goals. Opening on a shocking image of desperation before following the vulturous businessman played by Michael Shannon, who uses ruthless and morally and legally questionable methods to cash in on the housing market crash of 2007. The dialogue and placement of props and characters in this shot provide all the pertinent information, while leaving the audience speechless at the sheer indifference of Shannon's character. The rest of the film centers on a struggling single father played by Andrew Garfield, who is evicted from his home and forced to make some dubious choices in an effort to get it back. Diving headfirst into the practices that led to the economic downturn that saw millions forced out of their homes, the brutality met with apathy of the opening shot is echoed over and over again, right up until the pulse-pounding climax. Garfield does career best work, and Laura Dern gives another deeply affecting performance, but Michael Shannon is the crux of this film. His intensity and imposing presence make this an essential experience. If anyone else had played the character, I would have wished it was him. Expect to squirm in your seat, but fight through it and know that you'll regret passing this up. Number 15, Sicario. After seeing the movie Prisoners a few years ago, I immediately jumped on the Denis Villeneuve bandwagon. His follow-up, a brain-bending doppelganger thriller called Enemy, was far too opaque to make any kind of impact outside of the indie world, but this film promised more mainstream appeal with a lineup of A-listers boasting awards, trophies, and action movie cred as well. With Prisoners director of cinematography Roger Deakins on board to boot, this went from promising project to surefire success. The opening frames, this movie lays out a sun-scorched bleakness that permeates every layer of story and character. All notions of right and wrong go out the window from the get-go, as the depths to which the drug cartels are willing to sink so clearly undermine any idea of moral high ground, to the point that Emily Blunt's idealistic FBI agent is all but laughed out of the room whenever she brings it up. There's no word for the pace of this film other than excruciating, and I mean that as a compliment. An extended sequence involving an excursion into Mexico for an extradition goes on for what feels like hours, completely without musical underscoring, and culminates in one of the most intense action sequences of the year that barely lasts 30 seconds. Of course, Roger Deakins' cinematography delivers, giving visual clues about the direction the story is headed, most distinctly in a shot of soldiers silhouetted against a sunset, disappearing over a hill and being swallowed up by the darkness below, directly followed by a descent into a pitch-black tunnel leading to one of the most disturbing moments in a film full of disturbing moments. The performances sell this movie, featuring a truly dark and haunting effort by Benicio del Toro, and Emily Blunt proves once again that no amount of testosterone can overshadow her. It's a film of tough questions with answers that are hard to swallow, or worse, don't exist at all. A glimpse into the darkness if you really want to know what's there. Number 14, Bone Tomahawk. One of the strangest genre mashups that could possibly be imagined, writer-director S. Craig Zahler somehow makes it work and delivers one of the best screenplays of the decade along the way. This is a unique viewing experience because the ratio of laughs to times I had to look away from the screen was very nearly 1-to-1. This film manages to be funnier than some comedies I've seen this year, and also more frightening than many horror films I've seen this year. The dialogue is witty and lively, utilizing the English language to communicate as much as possible about a character in just a sentence or two. The character work is further strengthened by some creative casting that seems like it wouldn't work on paper, but actually feels like the only option when it's on the screen. The acting is pitch perfect across the board, with everyone resisting the urge to overact and just letting the material flow through them. Richard Jenkins is worthy of singling out for his consistent delivery across the full spectrum of emotion. Though it's violent and not shy about showing the gory details from the first second until the last 20 minutes, this is a western in the vein of The Searchers or True Grit. But then it takes a hard left turn into the Silence of the Lambs territory, and this is where I have to warn you about watching this movie. The climax of this film is incredibly graphic, and even in the context of the story, it is hard to watch. Please take this warning seriously and don't watch this if you're sensitive to violence. That said, I think this is a brilliant story that those with strong stomachs will get a lot of enjoyment out of. All I can say is proceed with caution. Number 13, Kingsman: The Secret Service. It's been a great year for spy movies, with all 4 major releases in the genre receiving moderately good to excellent reviews and outperforming expectations at the box office. And strangely enough, the James Bond entry was the lowest ranked on this list, even though it's not a bad film by any means. The rest are just that good, and my favorite by far is Kingsman. Celebration and send-up of 007 in equal measure, Matthew Vaughn once again proves himself more than capable of handling an action comedy comic book adaptation with his typically slick directing style, but isn't afraid to get messy with the action scenes. Hyper-stylized and urgently paced, there's just so much excitement in every second that you can't help but get pulled into having a good time. It's not the most original story, world domination, blah blah blah, but maybe that's the point. Rather than getting bogged down in plot details, Vaughn keeps things moving and relies on simplicity to keep any gaps in logic from growing into hang-ups for the audience. The fight choreography is great and really allowed to shine in some longer takes, and the physicality of the actors lends a great deal of believability to these scenes. Colin Firth is especially impressive given his age and background as a dramatic actor, having no need to bulk up for roles. And star Taron Egerton, who only needed to bring the physique, proves himself a capable actor with great range in his first major film. Samuel L. Jackson is having the time of his life playing an eccentric billionaire madman with a lisp, and just owning the scene every time he makes an appearance. A tendency toward vulgarity lowers the comedy bar a little, but there are enough actual jokes to sustain laughter, and more than enough heart to keep you invested. Perfect for those less serious moods. Number 12, The Peanuts Movie. Unlike so many other nostalgic properties that have gotten the big screen treatment in recent years, the Peanuts gang haven't faded from the public eye any time in the last several decades. The Charlie Brown Christmas special is an annual tradition for many, and the characters are marketing devices for a number of brands, so there's more of a built-in audience for something like this than, say, the Smurfs or Mr. Peabody and Sherman. So it's odd that it took so long for this film to be made, given movie producers' love of brand recognition. But with that time, the makers of this movie clearly didn't waste a moment. The story is very respectful of both Charles Schultz's comic strip and the earlier films. The most well-known recurring themes in the source material are all brought to life and given the utmost attention to detail. But in order to accommodate all of these disparate parts, the plot has to be as simple and as broad as possible. As a result, this really just feels like watching Charlie Brown live his life, and that's great. That's all the comic strip ever was, and it was all that was needed. It's never boring because, as simple as it may be, we can all find something to relate to. It works because it's universal, whereas a more complicated plot might be too specific for some to connect with. If I have any criticism of this film, it's that some of the Red Baron sequences with Snoopy go on a little too long and seem to exist just to justify the 3D on this film, but they still look great. There was some opposition to the CG animation style, but I think it works very well for this kind of film. Many of the iconic Peanuts images are still filmed as though they're in two dimensions, and the depth is used to great comic effect. This is just a nice film. It feels nice, and that's the way it should feel. Perfect family entertainment. Number 11, Star Wars The Force Awakens. To quote Patton Oswalt, JJ did it. And by it, he means gave fans the Star Wars movie they've been clamoring for since the prequels were released. Returning almost exactly to the formula of the original trilogy, J.J. Abrams has created a fantastic world of adventure that pays homage to its origins, but also expands the universe to allow for even more wonders. Now, Star Wars was a huge part of my childhood, so I'm totally biased towards this film, but I am willing to admit that this isn't perfect. To prevent another Phantom Menace disaster, Abrams does play it safe in certain areas, and there is an awful lot of fan service that likely won't stand the test of time. But there really isn't any flaw so glaring that this could be considered a bad film in any way. The progression of events from the end of Return of the Jedi to Force Awakens feels natural, the new characters are well-rounded and likable, with plenty of room to grow, and the action scenes are exciting and emotionally charged. The world of Star Wars has been established well for director Rian Johnson's follow-up, for which I'm wildly excited. New stars Daisy Ridley and John Boyega are excellent, as well as the underutilized Adam Driver and Oscar Isaac, who will likely have expanded roles in the sequels. This is exactly the Star Wars movie that was needed to endear the franchise to the lifelong fans, as well as introduce it to the next generation. JJ did it, indeed.